Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Wherever you may hail, I'm your host, John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus, where we bring you the most thought-provoking and informative current affairs analysis from around the world. Each episode, we invite top experts and analysts to share their insights on the most pressing issues of our time. From international relations and global economics to philosophy and science, no topic is off limits. Join us as we explore the complex and ever-changing landscape of the world, where we provide valuable perspectives on the events that shape our global community. For the past 20 years now, September 11th has come to be known as the date that kicked off the global war on terrorism. However, prior to this event, September 11th, 1973 was a date associated with the death of democracy in the Latin American country of Chile. Today, we'll be talking about something that hasn't been given much airtime, especially in Australia, the 50-year commemoration of the 1973 Chilean coup, which saw the toppling of Chile's democratically elected president, Salvador Allende. Joining us for this discussion from Sydney is Dr. Rodrigo Acuña. Rodrigo's research interests include inter-American relations, Cold War and post-Cold War Latin America, Venezuelan history and politics, human rights and development policies. And from Darwin in the Northern Territory, we're joined by Professor Clinton Fernandes. Clinton is an Australian historian and academic who is Professor of International and Political Studies at the University of New South Wales in Canberra, part of the Australian Defence Force Academy, my old alma mater. His work is primarily concerned with Australia's national security, in particular intelligence matters. But before we start, a shameless plug for ourselves. Please subscribe to our channel. We need the algorithm to find us, and by hitting the subscribe and like buttons, this is your contribution to the growth of what hopefully will become a South Australian global sensation. Rodrigo and Clinton, thank you for joining us on The Focus.
Good to be with you, John. Thanks for the opportunity.
Now, Clinton, can you provide some historical context about the events leading up to the Chilean military coup on September 11, 1973?
The basic facts are as follows. Chile is a wealthy country, unique and beautiful. It starts at in the desert, the Atacama Desert at the top. It goes through, beautiful grasslands, agriculture, all the way down to Antarctica. It's very rich in natural resources, in particular copper. Unfortunately, for most of the 50s, 60s, and early 70s, the copper resources were under the control of two American corporations, Kennecott Copper and Anaconda Copper. And there had been discussions about how can Chile actually get control of its own resources, because it needs it in order to develop its own economy. And the person of interest we're talking about today is Dr. Salvador Allende. He's a pediatrician, and I've likened him in the past to the Bernie Sanders of Chile. He ran for president in 1952, 1958. They had 6-year terms. And in 1958, he came very close to actually winning the presidency in his own right. I mean, it was just 3 points with another candidate that stopped him from doing that. And 64, he ran again. And on that occasion, the United States secretly funded 50% of his opponent's election campaign in order to defeat Allende, because they wanted control of Chile's copper. 1970, he finally won. He came first at the head of a 3-cornered race. And immediately after that, the United States decided it had to get rid of him. There were representations from Chilean oligarchs whose own position inside Chile relied on the American system of imperial control. And so the president at the time, Richard Nixon, and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, they were, of course, they thought about copper and Kennecott and Anaconda, but their real concern, we now know through the declassified record, was they had an imperial view of American foreign policy. Their real concern was what would the effect be on in other parts of the world, elsewhere in Latin America, but also in Europe, if Chile began to take control of its own resources, because independent economic nationalism was a threat if you believe that the resources of a country ought to be made available to your corporations in the manner desired by your corporations. Now, an independent economic nationalist is as bad, as far as the Americans are concerned, as a communist, because it has the same effect, right? And so they decided to get rid of him. Now, the obstacle was a very conservative but very honorable head of the military, General Rene Schneider. And he didn't want to have anything to do with a coup. So when the United States decided to move against Allende, he was the obstacle. And so the coup plotters, armed by the CIA, funded by them, they tried to disarm Rene Schneider, kidnap him, and take him across to Argentina, where there'd been a previous coup, military dictatorship. And he resisted. And in the exchange, he was shot. That brought all the Chileans out on the streets because they were appalled at the chief of their military being killed. And so it became very hard to then get rid of Allende. So what the United States decided to do was set up a coup climate. The words coup climate come up all the time in the classified records, which is now declassified. They wanted to make the economy scream. They wanted to make it ungovernable, right? That's the lead-in to the CIA requesting Australia to send its own intelligence agency to assist the CIA as a go-between between itself and the coup plotters and to help it create a coup climate. I think that's the relevant background.
Excellent. Thanks. Rodrigo, do you have anything else to add to what Clinton's just said?
Clinton's absolutely on point. That coup climate is what allowed the military to eventually organize itself and carry out the coup d'etat with the support of the United States. And for people that actually lived through that period, one of the observations which is really important is how shortly after the coup was successful, only a matter of days and week or so, the supermarkets, the shelves on the supermarkets were stocked once again. So it proved the argument of the Popular Unity government that key supermarket chains throughout the country were hoarding food in order to damage the Allende government. And, then you have mass repression, which is taking place after the coup, but you have the supermarket shelves, which are now full because the hoarding has stopped.
Mm. Rodrigo, the Pinochet regime is estimated to have killed over 3,000 people and subjected tens of thousands to internment and torture. Can you elaborate on the human rights violations committed during this period?
They were absolutely atrocious. The amount of people that were executed just within the first few weeks of the coup, it's estimated about 1,000 Chileans were executed in Santiago alone. And the full force of the Chilean military and then eventually the police intelligence, which was reshaped under Pinochet with the support of the CIA, when I'm talking about the DINA, the National Directorate of Intelligence. And they proceeded to carry out vast human rights violations. So the members of the military who were loyal to the constitution, a few weeks before the coup took place, they were arrested. And during the coup, then they were either tortured or went missing. The famous case of General Bachelet, I think he might have been a major at the time, and he was the father of the former president Michelle Bachelet. And now that element within the Chilean military was a minority, but they were there. They believed in respecting the constitution and allowing Allende's government to fulfill its mandate and then either win the next election or be voted out of office. But General Pinochet was not playing by the rules, and he then proceeded to outmaneuver the other members of the junta and then accumulate power and become the most powerful man in the country, together with Manuel Contreras, who was the head of the DINA. And yes, the human rights violations that were carried out were atrocious. We're talking about anything between people being arrested and beaten to people being interrogated under torture through the use of electricity, through the use of police dogs, which were trained to rape people that were detained. All sorts of horrific abuses were carried out. And then I guess one of the worst was disappearing people. So taking them on board helicopters and throwing them into the ocean. That was much more practiced in Argentina during the Argentine military dictatorship, but the Chileans did it as well. And that then creates a sense of enormous loss for the relatives because they don't have anywhere they can go and mourn their dead. They simply, the dead have now disappeared, and there's no physical trace. And occasionally, once every couple of years, there is a common grave found in Chile, like in many other parts of Latin America where US dictatorships were active. And people will travel there and then they'll, wait for the forensic experts to go through the remains, and then if the remains are identified that they are their relatives, then they'll proceed to host funerals and all the burial rites.
Rodrigo, how have the survivors and families of the victims coped with the trauma and injustice from the Pinochet era over the past 50 years? Are the wounds from this period properly closed now? And Clinton, please feel free to jump in if you have something to say about this too.
I don't think the wounds are properly healed. There are certain boundaries, there are certain lines that you don't cross, and once you cross those lines, then it's almost impossible to come back from that. So, just to give you an example, I have many family friends that suffered the impact of the dictatorship, and they, for example, one lady, her two brothers were part of President Allende's personal security team, and one of them was arrested and disappeared on the day or the next day after the coup d'etat, and until this day he's never been found. So his sister travels to Chile every few years when one of these common graves are uncovered, and she's there to try and see if her brother has been identified. Now, her other brother, who was also part of the presidential guard, the president's security team, he survived, but he was tortured in such a hideous manner that he has been disabled. He's disabled, and she has cared for him for many decades now. They're both still alive, and he has trouble communicating. She almost acts like a translator for him, and these are just cases of thousands of Chileans. The Allende family, we had the grandson of the president, Alejandro Allende, present at the New South Wales Parliament yesterday. And before that, he had a meeting at the New South Wales Teachers Federation, and he spoke of how 3 members of his family committed suicide, including his mother. So people that were tortured, people that were arrested, or people that had loved ones disappeared, they are broken. They some of them managed to recover and rebuild themselves and go on to have successful careers, and many others weren't. So those wounds will not heal, I guess, until those generations are no longer with us. But then you also have to look at intergenerational trauma. So I grew up in the Chilean Australian community, and the discussions that were held at my dinner table when I was 5, 6, 7, 8 years old were comparisons of torture stories, and that creates a intergenerational trauma. Now, I was lucky enough that my parents did not fall into becoming alcoholics or substance abuse, but many other Chileans' parents did, and then their children's lives were destroyed or impacted. So there is a lot of trauma which has taken place, and unfortunately, I don't think people will recover until those generations are no longer around.
Clinton, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I mean, it's deeply moving to see Rodrigo speaking so calmly, despite the obvious personal effect this has had. I would just think we could also look at other things like Australia's role, but also it's important to not focus. Yes, of course, the morality is a bad thing, but I want to take the arguments of the people who were behind the coup, and even today, there's a significant minority of people in Chile that claim the coup was necessary, that there wouldn't have been a Pinochet without an Allende, and look at all the good that Pinochet did. And I want to actually address that matter rather than focus only on the trauma, which is legitimate to do. So if you don't mind, I could just add that part there. Chile is known as the birthplace of the neoliberal program, which is about austerity, the privatization, the selling off of state assets, austerity programs, cutbacks on benefits, on welfare state, on social security, and of giving investors, private investors, more power even over governments. And so that model was spread to the rest of the world, at least the Western world, in the 1980s, and after the Soviet Union collapsed, into Eastern Europe in the 1990s. And of course, the global financial crisis of 2008 is where it is normally believed that neoliberalism was proven to be a failure. Yep. Right? And today, 15 years after the GFC, the global financial crisis of 2008, it's clear that it's been a failure because it's led to a very angry, atomized, insecure population that's pitted against each other, that can't plan for the future. They can't plan when they can, even whether they can have kids and get married because they don't know when they're going to be able to work next. And that's a result of the neoliberal assault on societies. But I want to say that as an economic historian, I mean, this is not controversial at all. Neoliberalism actually failed first in Chile, right? Pinochet's economic program failed. They brought in, it was perfect experimental conditions. There was no resistance because people were disappeared and tortured and arrested and so on. Unions were not basically allowed to be free. And so there was just no resistance. And so in a perfect laboratory setting, the so-called Chicago boys came in. This is the neoliberal free market people, and they tried a whole bunch of, to get the economy moving. And they had a lot of help. Don't forget, it's as Dr. Acuña said, the hoarding stopped, and all of a sudden the supplies were then brought in, so people could go back to the supermarkets and get food. Whereas in the past, under Allende, make the economy scream, they couldn't. So they had everything going for themselves, right? In 5 years' time, they crashed the economy. Right. Yeah. And so that's from 77 to about 82. By 82, the economy had crashed. The only thing that had not crashed was the copper company that Allende had nationalized, Codelco. Right. That was the source of the state revenues, the major source. And so in economic history, there's a joke that this is actually the Chicago road, not to the free market. It's the Chicago road to state socialism, because it's actually proven that the free market institutions, left to their own devices, will eat themselves up because they just eat the economy and eat society. That's exactly what's happened in the world today. You see this angry population that's atomized, that at each other's throat, and now it's accelerated through social media and further technology. But really, the economic insecurity that's driving so much resentment and anger and distrust of institutions, that was proven to be false, a flawed model, not today, but in Chile in 1982. So that's the point. I want to actually attack the Pinochet model in its own terms, not simply to focus only on the morality of it. That's my contribution, I would say.
Yeah, look, I have to say that I'm glad that you raised the Chicago School of Economic Philosophy and all that kind of thing, because yes, Chile was actually at the center of this grand experiment. But I suppose if one were a vengeful person on the system, one could say that now with the breakdown of economic rationalism as a philosophy, with people now starting to talk about universal basic income and various other economic models that are outside of that purview, and also with the breakdown of the globalist experiment, which also came from all of this.
Yes.
I mean, we're looking at major ructions at the moment, and what happens as a consequence of all of this is we can sit back, look down the TARDIS path, have a look at how Chile was managed during the Pinochet years, and foretell that this was not going to work out well. But no one did. No one did.
This is all the top economists at the Chicago School, Milton Friedman and his disciples. They had perfect experimental conditions to implement their model. 5 years later, it crashed. So that's I mean, there is another aspect to it, which is I'm sure you're going to get to, which is Australia's role. But I don't want to leave people thinking that, well, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. That you have to have some pain in order to have a better economy. The economy was worse after Pinochet's Chicago boys had gotten had spent 5 years on it.
Is that also now, if I can, pose this question, the difficulties that we've seen over the last couple of years in Chile, where there have been street protests, is this also a consequence of failed economic policies that have not been able to be rooted out completely, and is also acting as a sort of magnet for the pro-Pinochet mob, who say, no, Pinochet was a great guy and look what he did for the economy. Yeah, if you profited from the economy, great, you did well. If you didn't, and the vast majority didn't, then of course, you have another story to tell, right?
If I can just add to the point that Clinton raised, he's completely right. And it reminded me of a lengthy article that Orlando Letelier, Allende's Minister for Foreign Affairs, wrote I think it was in The Nation in 1975. And he went through the economic policies which were being implemented and were already hurting Chileans. So he wrote a very powerful argument about how the economic policies that were being implemented by the Pinochet regime were actually not benefiting the majority of Chileans. Chileans were going to get poorer. Now, by the 1980s, the crisis was quite severe. And once Pinochet stepped down in the early, I think 1990, 1991, the Chilean population was obviously jubilant. There was no longer a military dictatorship, and they were sucked into purchasing a whole bunch of credit cards, and they thought, okay, maybe now things are going to start looking up. But fast forward only a few years after that, and you're seeing again a return of industrial action, massive demonstrations, the birth of a radical student movement. That's where the current president comes from. And by 2019, the population, vast sectors of the population had enough. Chile is the only country, it is my understanding, that has privatized water. Now, that's fundamental. I mean, that's a human right. But it has privatized all other key aspects of the economy. So by late 2019, when another increase in the metro fares occur, Santiago has a very large underground metro system. The students said, look, we've had enough, and they decided to take to the streets. And people supported them. And the next thing you know, within a few weeks, you have a social explosion which became so large and even so violent that the Piñera administration declared martial law for 2 weeks, and the military were called onto the streets. And again, human rights abuses were reported, the use of rubber bullets. Hundreds of Chileans lost a section of their eyesight. And that is a direct result to people resenting and rejecting the free market, the neoliberal economic model, because they are aware, despite the spin by media outlets like The Economist, and so you can add a long list to them, they actually lived the privatization program by the military dictatorships and the post-dictatorship governments.
Wow. Okay. So, guys, we started off talking about Washington's role, American imperial objectives back in the 1970s. But how did Washington's desire to thwart leftist politics in Latin America generally, but in Chile in particular, play to Pinochet's coup against Allende? I mean, there was America's four-dimensional chess master at the time, Henry Kissinger, who was, as we know, US Secretary of State then. Does he bear any responsibility for events in Chile? I mean, it's a difficult one to actually ask, because when you look at Chile, there were so many internal and external factors, push and pull factors, that to actually sit down and say, well, this event or this thing was fully and solely responsible for what happened in Chile would be incorrect, right? It's a much more complicated situation.
Oh, look, I agree.
Yeah.
It always is. And so here's the general dynamic, and it happens in a number of places. In Indonesia, 1965, there was a so-called coup and a foiled coup, and basically it led to the destruction of the Indonesian Communist Party, who were actually not a revolutionary party, but a party committed to advancing the interests of the poor within the system. And that was done with the support of the Indonesian military and conservative, or I would say reactionary, Islamic militias. But they could never have done that had it not been for the assistance given to them by the United States and by
Yeah.
Australia.
Mm.
And to the extent that the names of the people who had to be targeted and arrested and so on and disappeared were not collected by the Indonesian military or the Islamic militias. They were collected by the American embassy, and that's from their declassified cables. The American embassy's declassified cables actually say that these people have no idea, seem to have little idea who to actually target. So we're giving them all this information. Anyway, that's sort of what happened in Chile as well. But it goes beyond that. In every society, you will find, some people who want to preserve their own power, and they do that by collaborating with the imperial power.
Yeah.
So obviously, slavery would never have happened without the total collaboration of some slave communities in Africa on the coast, because they're the ones that actually went inland and got the slaves from the next community, and then sold them to the people on the ships. We take them to Brazil and to North America and places like that.
Mm.
So it's never the case that these people have no agency. So that's not the claim that's being made. So what is the claim being made? The claim is that we know from the declassified record that it was an attempt to firstly set up a brain drain in Chile. So the Australian embassy put out information which was carried by the biggest newspaper in Chile at the time, led by Augustin Edwards, who was like the Rupert Murdoch of Chile. Right? He's the media baron, totally dependent on the United States for his power. And they were trying to get an educated, technologically qualified Chileans to leave the country, to emigrate to Australia, right? In order to make it hard for Allende's government to run the economy. Then there was a question of wheat and beef. And so after the coup, the United States went to Australia and to Argentina, which was also under military dictatorship, and they said, can you increase your sales of food just to make sure that it's there? But more than that, the first coup attempt, which is in 1970, which led to the murder of the Chilean chief of the defense force who refused to participate, that was entirely a CIA operation. Yes, there were some Chileans who actually, ambushed the car that he was in. Would never have happened without Nixon actually put this in his papers. But there's $10 million. Go for it. That was we have the Nixon's handwritten notes. Give $10 million. This is in September 1970, in order to start the coup. Right? So yes, there is always a Chilean agency inside, but there is the United States there as well. And we now know that at every step of the way, in the whole, from 1970 when the coup failed until 1973 when the actual coup succeeded, they constantly looked to the United States for guidance and reassurance that they would be protected. If anything went wrong, they would be exfiltrated and given asylum somewhere else. So that level of involvement, was indispensable for the Chileans, the military to carry out the coup. That's the best way. I don't wish to, put all the blame on the United States, because that's not reality. But in reality, without the United States, these guys would never have had the mental focus and confidence, or even the resources to do it.
So how did the deputy sheriff of the United States Australia play its role in all of this?
Well, I don't want to talk too long, sorry, because I want to give Dr. Acuña a chance to actually show you his
Absolutely.
expertise. But I'll be very quick. The United States asked Australia to send the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, our external human intelligence agency, to set up a station in Chile in order to act as a go-between between the CIA itself and the coup plotters. There was a sense that if the United States embassy was shut down, then they would be denied, some valuable base for operations, in addition to whatever safe houses they had. So Australia going in there, which we already had an embassy, that would not have been a problem. And we set up a safe house. We know from the documents that we've declassified that they set up a safe house. We know they got a car. They bought a safe in the house. We even know the combination number of that safe. And we also know that there were ASIO officers. So I'm not talking about ASIS only, the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, but our counterintelligence agency in Australia, the ASIO officers, were masquerading as immigration officers and were in our embassy in Chile. Right. And the immigration minister, Clyde Cameron, found this out in 1974. He was shocked. What's going on? He said, and even in 72, with the Whitlam its time election victory. And he didn't want it to happen. He was just couldn't understand why ASIO officers were masquerading as immigration officers in his portfolio and were posted to an embassy. Well, unfortunately, and I'll end my point here, we do know why. Okay, there were credible allegations raised in Parliament, even in 1985, that there were people in Chile who would come to the Australian embassy and apply for humanitarian assistance or protection of some sort, and they were then betrayed to the Chilean secret police. So we know the names of two of those people, David and Marcelo Mino Logan, Mino-Logan. They'd been given entry to Australia in a special humanitarian program. But in our embassy, along with the ASIO officers who were there, was a locally employed Chilean woman who was a relative of the head of the Chilean secret police. And so those brothers, having been identified, they confided all their personal information to our embassy. They were then betrayed to the Chilean secret police and they were executed. And this happened to a lot of people, we believe. And so that's sort of our role as well. So it's not just the ASIS, it's the ASIO officers.
So were Australian authorities actually acting on behalf of the United States? I mean, is that how it worked? Or was there a sovereign Australian reason for why we interfered in the way that we did?
We can answer that question very easily. No, there was no reason, no sovereign Australian reason. It was basically in order to assist the United States. And we know that. I mean, that even came from the head of ASIS. The head of ASIS briefed Gough Whitlam, Bill Robertson, and he told Whitlam, look, when Whitlam got elected, firstly, he told Whitlam, we've got something called ASIS, because the opposition leader was not told about the existence of ASIS. Right? ASIS's existence was never formally acknowledged until 1977, when Malcolm Fraser made a statement in Parliament. So when Whitlam came in, he was in 1972, he suddenly was told, we've got something called ASIS. Here are where the stations are. And by the way, we're running an operation in Chile. And Robertson tells him, sign this order, and we withdraw the station. And we'll sort it out with the Americans. You don't need to worry about that. Whitlam said, no, I can't justify it. But on the other hand, I don't want to give the CIA the wrong impression. So basically, there was no Australian interest in that sense, no.
Okay, Rodrigo, I mean, it's amazing. What role did amnesty laws play in protecting former perpetrators of human rights violations under the Pinochet regime? And how has this impacted justice and accountability generally?
Once Pinochet stepped down in 1990, he tied the system in. So he continued to remain the head of the Chilean armed forces until 1998. And he became what was called a senador vitalicio, a senator for life. Now, he never actually attended the Chilean Senate, but there was a seat there, and there was a little plaque where that was his seat. So it was a reminder to the general population that I may have stepped down, but I'm still around, and I don't want any of my boys to be touched unless it's sort of the public pressure was enormous. So the head of the Dino was arrested, and yes, they went after some figures in the first few years, but for almost in fact over a decade, many key figures of the regime were not touched, precisely because the armed forces remained loyal to the Pinochet philosophy. And it wasn't until Pinochet was actually arrested in London in the late 1990s. He was there for some back surgery, and a Spanish judge, Garzón, he decided to request his extradition to Spain because there were some Spaniards that were killed during the coup. There were many foreigners that were actually killed in Chile during the coup and then after. And then the British legal system and the political establishment found themselves in quite an uncomfortable situation, where you had this former head of a brutal military regime who has now, there is a warrant for his arrest. So they arrested him, and then his lawyers argued that he was too old and he couldn't remember anything. They used all sorts of excuses, and Then the House of Lords was involved, and a lot of back and forth. But eventually, he was released. And once he returned to Chilean soil, I only saw the interview again a few days ago. He gave an interview to a journalist in Miami of Cuban heritage, and his memory was he was fine. He was sharp, and in fact, he once he stepped off the airplane in Santiago when he arrived. He made a point to get up out of his wheelchair and to indicate to the ultra right in Chile that he could still walk, and he was okay. So, and the final point is that the Chilean judicial system as well was tied into the military. So that judicial system, those judges were connected to the regime. And in, again, roughly the same year, I think 1997 or 1998, 99, there was a Chilean journalist, a brave Chilean journalist called Alejandra Matus, and she exposed the connections between the Chilean judicial system at the time to the military regime. And her book was banned, and there was an arrest warrant issued. There was a arrest warrant issued for her arrest, and she ended fleeing the country and returned to, I think, Canada or the United States. She's one of the most respected journalists in the country, but at the time she had to flee, and she had to, and her book was not published. It was published sort of in the black market, and this is almost 10 years after the dictatorship has ended.
Just continuing on that thought, current Chilean president, and forgive my pronunciation, is it Gabriel Boric? Because it
Correct.
Sounds like a Slavic. Yeah, okay.
Yes, it is. It is.
Yeah, okay. So President Gabriel Boric recently initiated a plan to clarify the circumstances of the disappeared victims and grant access to information. Can you explain the significance of this policy change and its potential impact?
Well, it's still trying to conclude that period of Chilean history, because as I said before, the Chilean judicial system was dragging its feet. It was still too connected to the military regime. So yes, there were figures of the regime which were put on trial, and they were incarcerated, but there were many others that were not, and that's what this process is about. It's about still trying to hold those people accountable, and still trying to, while they are alive, to try and find information and possibly the remains of the disappeared.
Clinton, if I could ask you, what do you think is the trust that average Chileans have in their national security forces, but particularly the army, following all of the egregious crimes that have been committed under the Pinochet regime? How does that actually work? You know, I mean, it's hard for someone in Australia, not having lived that experience, to understand that kind of splitting apart of the nation state, so much so that one of its key institutions is turned against its people, and then after all is said and done, you don't have any option. You've got to, you know, for your own national security perspective, you need to trust and rehabilitate that institution. Otherwise, you don't have a military, or you don't have intelligence forces. So how does that all work?
I'll defer to Dr. Acuña for his thing about Chilean public opinion, but I will say this. It's not just Chile. You know, there was a number of military dictatorships in Latin America that have had to deal with this problem, and it starts in 1954. You know, with the coup, and then 1964 in Brazil, and then of course Bolivia even before Chile, and then Chile itself, and then later on Peru and elsewhere. It's called the Southern Cone. It was full of coups, right? Well, to a large extent, and this is, you know, something that ties into something that you asked me before. Once September 11, 2001 happened, the Bush administration, George Bush the son, fought the war on terror, and all the effort, you know, almost all the military and intelligence effort and so on went into the Middle East and into Afghanistan and so on. And as a result, the Chilean and the other Latin American militaries lost the attention of their biggest patron, namely the United States. So at the time when Bush was sometimes accused of neglecting Latin America, that's the time at which their power weakened, right? And so in many Latin American countries, there was a what they call a pink tide, a kind of a wave of democratization that began to occur, precisely because America's imperial attention went elsewhere. And if you look at the war on terror and the black sites where people were extraordinarily kidnapped, it's called extraordinary rendition. They were kidnapped and they were tortured in order to extract information. There was not a single black site in Latin America. They were all in Poland and in the Middle East. Clients like the Mubarak in Egypt and Assad in Syria before he fell out with the United States as well. And so there was not a single black site, torture site in Latin America, not just in Chile. So in that sense, the people in the junta that were in the 70s and 50s, 60s, 70s, they're now old or dead, right? And so it's a new generation. And ultimately, I guess they still feel they're all Chilean, so they have to come to terms with that. But that is an important calculation, that the imperial patron's attention was diverted. Dr. Acuña would probably be able to say more about Chilean public opinion.
In terms of Chilean public opinion towards the military and the carabineros, the militarized police force, the polls have long been shocking. The trust in those institutions have plummeted, and especially with the influx of the drug trade, which was not really present on a street level in Chile. Now the carabineros have become quite corrupt, and you have a narco culture developing in Chile, and that's precisely because of corrupt elements within the armed forces and within the police. And there have been members who have written about this and been critiquing and saying, we really need to clean this up because we're going to become possibly another Mexico. Now, in terms of how that's the public opinion and how the institutions are viewed by the general Chilean public, the current minister of defense is actually a lady called Maya Allende, and Maya Allende is actually Salvador Allende's daughter, and she was given that portfolio precisely to try and boost confidence in the armed forces and to try and democratize them. Now, the carabineros, part of the Boric government's agenda originally was to dismantle the carabineros. People want to see that militarized police force dismantled and something better and far more democratic replaced. But he has capitulated to the pressure by those institutions and the political right. So unfortunately, it doesn't look like the carabineros will be dismantled. But again, going back to public opinion, the public opinion of them is so poor that they're actually having problems recruiting people. And that's despite the fact that for Latin American standards, the carabineros are probably one of the least corrupt police forces and have probably one of the better standards of living throughout Latin America. If you were to join a police force in Latin America, you probably want to join the carabineros because you would have a health plan, a good retirement plan, all those sorts of deals. So it's interesting how those institutions are viewed and how they are operating and how the political battle that's taking place over them. I'll add as well the concept of trying to democratize these institutions now, and the connection to the United States. So there have been calls within Latin America, in Bolivia, for all ties with the United States at an institutional military level to be cut. And the reason is because of this, if you go back to the School of the Americas and how they have these, I guess you could call them sleeper agents. So when they want to carry out a coup d'etat, the political right will get together with the US ambassador and they'll carry out their usual lobbying, and then they can call upon these people. So there have been calls for alternative institutions to be established. The Union of South American Nations, which was founded in 2008, they were talking about these sorts of ideas, and there is a push to have those institutional links either cut completely or significantly reduced, because there have been too many cases in Latin America where the United States has been able to find members of the armed forces that have been all too happy and willing to cooperate with them in carrying out coup d'etats.
Interesting. Just listening to you guys talk, I'm kind of reminded of a sort of pattern of Cold War politics that played out from Iran in the early 1950s when we had the Americans interfere to get rid of Mossadegh. and then you ended up with the problems in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. Then, of course, you had all of the problems that we're talking about right now in Chile and Latin America generally as well. It seems that the Americans were playing to a particular model of, foreign interference, shall we say. And actually, it was interesting because when you were mentioning the Whitlam government, for instance, we also know that the Americans were not too pleased with Prime Minister Whitlam and may have had a slight hand in his ouster as well. So whether you happen to be a friend, a foe, or sitting on the fence, you got to be careful of those Americans. But God, I don't know.
Well, they, as you know, listen, you're a an expert in this field as well. But the United States, when they were planning for the post-war world, they quite explicitly decided to learn from the British. I mean, that's actually in their planning documents and in the memoirs. So George Kennan, for example, in his book
that's right.
American Diplomacy, he actually says what we got to do is learn from the British, because we can't physically control a country. We can't physically rule countries like the way the British ruled, say, India, or France ruled Indochina. But we have to have control over their sovereignty anyway. How do we do that? We've got to do it indirectly, right? But the British aim was quite explicit, and look, it goes right back to Australia, the founding of Australia, European settlement here. At the very same time that the first and second fleets were coming to Australia, Britain was also in control of Bengal, which is today Bangladesh. It was a very rich country. And they put in place a system whereby landlords would run the society for them with British force in the background and sometimes in the foreground. But they always rely on an intermediary, an indigenous intermediary, to run the society, because there aren't that many British people compared to, say, people from Bengal. And so that model of trying to find a client who is repressive enough to handle most problems directly, but with imperial force in the background, was the British model of governance. And it is what the Americans learned. And in Latin America, that's the reason why there's been so many coups. In the past, there were people who were blaming it on Catholicism because it's a very Catholic country. The Catholics had all these coups, but then all of a sudden you find the coup happening in Greece, which is absolutely not Catholic, and it's the same dynamic. So that's the general idea, that they had to learn from the British, and what they needed was an intermediary, an indigenous intermediary, to run the society, and that neo-colonial kind of indirect control is the basic preferred model.
Actually, it's really interesting you say that, because, of course, there is some historical evidence, or at least there are British historians who have suggested quite strongly that Latin America was an indirect extension of British power, in spite of the Monroe Doctrine, and that the British had undue influence over many Latin American countries after they had declared their independence from Spain. And yes. I think that must have also been a thorn in the side of the Americans as they were trying to establish some form of control over Latin America during the early 1900s.
So basically, the Monroe Doctrine is from 1823. So this is the 200th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine as well this year. But that was aspirational. At the time, America did not have the military or the naval power to expel Britain. And the largest foreign investor in Argentina, which developed the beef industry and the primary sector in Argentina, was British investments. Right. And so it took a while for them to kick Britain out of Latin America, but they eventually did it. But definitely, as usual, your grasp of history is incomparable. And so, Britain was in fact I've never seen, actually, I don't know any radio hosts who ask these sorts of questions.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for that, Clinton. Anyway, look, I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast. And from Sydney and Darwin, Australia, we're speaking with Dr. Rodrigo Acuña and Professor Clinton Fernandes on Chile, 50 years on from the Pinochet coup. Now, how has the international community reacted to Chile's efforts to address the legacy of the Pinochet regime, particularly with regards to human rights violations? The European Union, for instance, they put a lot of stock on trying to act as the world's moralizers, while the Americans kind of look like the West's bother boys, effectively. So, what have the Europeans brought to the equation in terms of trying to broker a sense of healing and a sense of, well, okay, yeah, you had your Pinochet, but now it's all going well. Have they had any role whatsoever?
Look, I think you need to look at the different sectors of society. So if you're looking at the trade unions, if you're looking at the human rights organizations, if you're looking at lawyers which deal with these sorts of issues, their positions and their efforts have been nothing but absolutely amazing. Committed researchers, etc., etc. The list is too long. They have provided an enormous amount of support towards democratizing Chile, towards human rights. There were a group of doctors, I think, in Sweden, which started a very important organization during the social uprising of 2019, and they put out a large amount of video footage of the human rights violations which were taking place. Now, if you look at at an institutional level, they certainly will pay lip service to democratization and human rights in Latin America. But I find it interesting that there has never been a Latin American dictator general which has ended up at The Hague. And there's a very good reason for that. If you ever if a General Pinochet or a Videla or the goons in El Salvador or Guatemala ended up at The Hague and they started talking, then the level of embarrassment in Washington would explode. And that's precisely why they're not that you know they've never been taken there. I'm assuming, and I think it's a reasonable educated guess. So there. The rhetoric is, well, yes, we support human rights and we support transparency, but in terms of just supporting this process on the ground. I mean, the man who pulled the trigger and killed the Chilean folk singer Victor Jara, he's been living comfortably in Miami. There's a Netflix documentary about him, and he's been living there for many decades. Adriana Rivas, who is a former DINA intelligence agent, she entered Australia in 1978. She's wanted for 7 murders in Chile since 2007. And she was arrested. She fled Chile and returned to Australia. Was working here as a nanny and as a cleaner. She was only arrested in 2019 after a huge campaign by the Chilean Australian community. We managed to raise over 600 signatures and get members of the Senate to support us in having her extradition request. The warrant which was put out by Interpol, having that enacted, and that's why she was arrested, and she's currently sitting in a Sydney prison. But now, after 15 months of her no longer defending herself through the Australian judicial system, we're still waiting for the Attorney General to give the green light for her to be sent to Chile and be put on trial.
Marcia Tambuti Allende, the granddaughter of President Allende, mentioned mixed feelings about the 50-year commemoration of the Pinochet coup. Would it not just be better to forgive and forget to prevent opening old wounds, or would Chile have benefited from a South African-style truth and reconciliation process?
We had a South African-style truth and reconciliation process, but as I mentioned before, it never went far enough. And as I said before as well, there are certain boundaries that you don't cross. So imagine, I mean, how many parents have been in the situation where they've briefly lost the toddler in the supermarket for 5 minutes, and the pain and grief that they experience. Now imagine losing one of your loved ones for decades and never knowing where they are. In Argentina, it was quite common for the children of the political prisoners to then be adopted by members of the armed forces. So on the one hand, the armed forces have murdered their parents, and on the other hand, members of the armed forces who can't have children themselves are adopting those children. Now, once those children, some of them found out what their background was, they broke off all contact with their parents. Others refused to meet their relatives, their original relatives, and just said, "Look, it's a lie. These are nothing but left-wing propaganda lies, etc., etc." So I don't think those wounds really will heal, and I don't mean to be pessimistic, but I just don't think those wounds can ever completely heal. On a personal and on a wider sort of societal level. And then you've got the institutions. So if Chile had moved on from the Pinochet dictatorship, we would not have had the social explosion of 2019, which saw the country paralyzed for several months and thousands of people injured and wounded from police and military repression.
As an Australian, of course, this is a matter for the Chileans to handle, But what can we do? In the first instance, we should accept that other than the names of the ASIO and ACIS officers, everything should be declassified.
Yeah.
There is no national security question that's going to harm the Australian people 50 years later by keeping those records secret. As a South Australian, your leading senator is Senator Wong, who is also the foreign minister. And it's up to her to not duck shove the matter to the National Archives, which is the technical term, but to actually make a decision, show leadership as the foreign minister, and take proactive steps to declassify foreign affairs records to show who was in the embassy, in our embassy, in Chile, not the names of our ASIO or ACIS officers, because they should always be kept secret. However, the information that they had, who were the Chileans who were coming to the embassy asking for protection? What information was shared about that? All of those details remain classified, but this is not national security in any meaningful sense for Australia. And so whatever the Chileans decide to do, the Truth and Reconciliation or justice and so on, we as Australians have our own options, and we should be declassifying those records with the appropriate caveats.
I would agree with that, but of course we know from the American experience with the John F. Kennedy assassination, so and so many decades after the assassination, again, no major national security issue at stake here. Why don't they declassify what went on, I should say? It's now still an area shrouded in conspiracy. It should not be. And arguably, you're exactly right. I mean, we should be able to be having this discussion and freeing that information out there for the historical record.
Yeah, ironically, the United States has declassified about 16,000 records on Chile.
Yeah,
PIA records.
Well,
as a direct at the direct request of the Chilean government, they began to do that, and they kept doing that. And we should do the same. I mean, there's no reason why we have to hold on to this stuff. It's 50 years old. What the only reason to hold on to this is to protect the intelligence agencies from the public, from a democratic debate as to how the agency should be used. Right?
Yeah.
The security protects them. It doesn't actually protect Australia.
But I mean, you and I both know that Australians generally are a very apathetic lot. Would we be fired up about, this kind of revelation today, 50 years after the coup? I mean, so much time has passed. Australians never really, galvanize around a passionate topic or, what point will that serve? Just playing devil's advocate.
Absolutely. No, I please go as hard as you like. We do know that when the truth is sometimes told, it just breaks out sometimes.
Yeah.
People are rightly outraged. Now, they do have other commitments. They do have to, earn a living and look after their family and pay the mortgage and so on. But in the case of Timor, for example, as soon as the leaked material started coming out, people were absolutely outraged and they got in the streets. There's a very good book by Nick Jose, Jose, called The Idealist. He's just published it. I think it's going to be released next month. And it's a fiction book. It's about that. It's about the sacrifice of an intelligence officer who revealed information and which created public concern. What about the war crimes in Afghanistan? Once the public sees this, they are repelled by it. Now, of course, they expect the institutions to work. And if the institutions don't work, you can't expect the individual member of the public to get angry by themselves. But we do know from experience that once they are told about the reality, they don't like it, they oppose it.
Yeah. Okay, Clinton and Rodrigo, there have been concerns expressed about the continued support for Pinochet's legacy within Chile's right-wing parties. Can you elaborate on the political dynamics and the potential for a return to authoritarianism?
Authoritarianism has as a political philosophy has certainly had a broader appeal in the last few years in Chile. They almost started to run out of arguments. The economic argument was one. They used to make the argument that yes, there were excesses under the general, but at least he wasn't corrupt like those Central American dictators, until over $20 million were found in U.S. bank accounts. And so they've been running out of arguments. But of course, they have an ally, a very important ally, which is the media in Chile. And the media, the Mercurio, which is the country's leading newspaper, the head of El Mercurio at the time of the Allende government, he went to Washington. He's actually the only Chilean from that sector which had direct meetings with the CIA. That was Peter Combo. I was listening to him recently at the National Security Archive, and his newspaper then promoted the idea that the Allende government was weak and something needed to be done. So the Mercurio has never apologized for that. It supported the dictatorship for 17 years. And there are other sectors of the Chilean media which support these types of arguments. So on the one hand, a lot of Chileans are aware that it's one of the most privatized countries in the world. They took to the streets. They recognized that the country's constitution, which was established under the military dictatorship, it needs to change. But then once the social unrest calmed down, then protesters went back home. Then they have been buying into many of these arguments that Chile or Chileans at their core are a people that are unruly, and we need a strong man, or we need someone with a vision, and is going to get everyone into line. And the gentleman that came close to winning the last presidential election, it was quite embarrassing for him because he was connected. His brother was a minister under Pinochet, and his grandfather was a card-carrying member of the Nazis. So, if you want to look for connections between the Chilean right, you can look for them, and they go right back to the Nazis in Germany.
Yeah, let's not even bring up Argentina, hey? Okay, so guys, do you think that enough attention is placed on Latin America as a potential place of interest for Australia? Have the recent influx of immigrants from Latin America made any substantial difference to how Australia sees Latin America generally, especially our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade? And the reason why I asked this question is that when we were lucky enough, at Sage International, were lucky enough to get a research grant from the Australian Department of Defence, we went on a research trip to Canberra, and we wanted to address the notion of the Indo-Pacific and the strategic dynamics therein. We got great responses from all the embassies that we reached out to. Strangely enough, the Latin Americans were front and center. But my colleague and I, we didn't get the best of receptions because we had 12 Latin American ambassadors sitting around the table grilling us, thinking that we were from DFAT, from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, criticizing the institution of our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for basically only putting 2 sentences on Latin America, an entire continent with about 300 million people, 2 sentences in the importance of Australia's foreign policy. Now, I mean, I understand that Australia has a limited understanding of many things, but, when it comes to having that sort of sophisticated ability to reach out to the rest of the region, a region by which we are trying to recreate, this notion of the Indo-Pacific, well, certainly Latin America is part of that frame. It may be a geographically distant and removed part of it, but the fact that we just don't pay no attention. And again, it comes back to, let's look at Chile and let's look at Australia's position and what we did and why we don't know anything about what we did. I mean, the ignorance is astounding, but that really comes from the fact that we just don't pay that continent much attention. Have the local migrant communities that have come from Latin America, is that sort of changing it, at least at a public level, at a more popular level?
Well, I can address just the policy level.
Yeah.
We are, in fact, investing in a diplomatic presence, but in the mining-related areas. And in fact, so the Indo-Pacific is obviously, where half of Latin America is involved, because the Latin American giant like Brazil is not a part of the Pacific; it's part of the Atlantic. But certainly Ecuador, where Hancock Prospecting, the Gina Reinhardt private vehicle, does have interests in Ecuador, and also in Chile, which is now very, very important because of the lithium resources. The mining that's going on at very high altitudes, is something that's regarded as perhaps important for the renewable energy transition. But it's also environmentally, quite brutal. We're talking about dry areas with not much water, but you need to get the water out in order to get the lithium. And so at that level, yes, there is interest, but I don't know about the Latin American diaspora in Australia. I leave that to Rodrigo.
Well, the Chilean community historically has been one of the largest communities in Australia, and certainly the presence, or their presence, our presence, is I mean, we've long reached out to and had many political allies, as I said before, the trade union movement, progressive politicians, and they've been supportive of us, for example, in our efforts to extradite Adriana Rivas. In terms of DFAT, I would agree with Clinton that its focus is mainly on mining and economic interest. And while those interests are certainly important, the rest of DFAT, the information that they release, I've actually criticized them, and publicly there was a meeting held a few years ago that I attended, and I proposed to them that could they please update their profile on Latin America, on Latin American countries, because their information was actually inaccurate. It was very broad, and it was creating complications for university students to travel there because of the complexity. So, for example, what I'm talking about is, for example, there are some cities in Latin America which are extremely safe. They have a very low crime rate. They're perfectly safe for foreigners to travel, even if they have very little knowledge of Spanish. Now, there are other cities which are certainly quite dangerous, and you need to be well aware where you're going. You need a good understanding of the language. And I just said to them, is it possible for you guys to please update your website and specifically be a little bit more detailed in your information, because it's a problem for student visas, and even at times for academics to travel. It just complicates things, and that shouldn't be the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, guys, last question. I've saved the best for last, I think.
Okay.
Anthropologist and author Jared Diamond said that Chile had a thriving democratic tradition before it fell into dictatorship, a century and a half of democracy, in fact. But according to Diamond, Chileans began hardening political positions in the years prior to the coup and forgot the art of compromise. Do you think that Chile's experience serves as a good example in what can go wrong in an established democracy?
I'll just take that. Jared Diamond, do you know what his speciality is?
Anthropology.
It's the gallbladder. That's what his PhD is.
Okay.
Guns, germs, and steel. He's not an economic historian at all. The claims he's made have actually been criticized quite heavily, but inside the technical economic journals. His specialty is on the gallbladder. It's actually on biology. It's not at all about. Okay, so the other claims about technology. Look, he's written his book, which I've read, right? About the backwardness of say African societies and so on. All that is he's looking at the surface. Not a single mention of the fact that it was the colonial experience that created the backwardness. So it's not as though, say, the Chileans lack the ideas of what to do, or the Argentinians or the Ecuadorians or lack ideas, or India, for example, under Britain, but rather they were forcibly deindustrialized. So that level of power as emanating from the West has always been missing. There's not a single sentence of that in Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. Now, as for the thing, yes, of course, he's describing the tension in the 50s and 60s, especially in the 60s, about the importance of Chileans getting control of their own natural resources. And the lack of compromise he's talking about is, in fact, the oligarchs who are in cahoots with the American corporations in Anaconda and Kennecott. and they rely for their own oligarchic position on Chile being dependent on just producing raw materials to send to the United States and to Europe so that they can manufacture advanced stuff and then, remain dependent. So it's not as though a lack of compromise or lack of ideas is behind the developments in Chile, but the enforced power emanating from the imperial center with the collaboration of elite elements in Chilean society that leads to the polarization. That's my take on it.
Just on that, the book that I was actually referring to from that little grab was his latest book called Upheaval. And in that, he did make the claim that, prior to Chile falling over into dictatorship, it was an active and established democracy, actually the only democracy in Latin America, according to Diamond. Yes. Now, if that were the case, the point was raised, and I think it's a valid point to put forward because of all the trouble that democracies around the world are currently facing at the moment. And arguably all of those troubles relate back to what we were talking about before, the Milton Friedman Chicago School style economic model, which is failing everywhere. And of course, can't underpin democracy because the widening gap between the rich and the poor, between the haves and the have-nots, these are now pre-revolutionary times that we're living through, and I don't think we're going to come out well. And we just have to look at the United States under the Trump presidency to see that what we would have considered the imperial center, the center for democracy in the West, that was quite easily seen to almost fall over on January 6th, on the January 6th effort. And, again, how does Chile's experience in terms of having been an active democracy and then going into dictatorship and a full polarization of society, how does that as a model affect the rest of us? Because surely there are lessons to be learned. And I think that that's what Diamond was trying to sort of put forward in Upheaval, at least, yeah?
Okay, I haven't read Upheaval, but let's look at Chile. 1950s, 1960s, yes, Chileans had the right to vote. They had the formal trappings of democracy. It wasn't compulsory voting like Australia, but they had the right to vote. But what the system relied on was political quietude, people accepting their lot in life. And if you're born poor, that's the way it's going to be. That's the way God planned it. That's just life, right?
Was that a Catholic thing? Is that a Catholic thing, Rodrigo?
I think it had a lot to do with the reactionary nature of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, yes.
And in fact, the Vatican, John Paul II, he was very good on Soviet repression, very bad on Latin American repression. Yeah. He opposed attempts by ordinary people to change their lives. So yes, what Diamond is talking about is in fact the political quietude and the defeatism of the 50s and 60s. And once that began to end, that's actually, technically, it codes in American political science, it codes as upheaval, right? Yeah. But in that case, any attempt at democracy, 1830s Britain, the Chartists demanding the right to vote, is upheaval. Yeah. Unless one accepts permanent quietude and accepting one's fate, doing nothing to change it, that might satisfy the conventions of American political science because they code as upheaval and not upheaval based on strike or not a strike or protest or not a protest. But it's the resistance to democracy that caused the coup. It wasn't the demands of Chileans for a better life that caused the coup.
Can I just add just a little bit on Chilean history? The argument made that Chile was a stable democracy. Yes, there are merits to that argument. Yes, it was a stable democracy until certain sectors of the population started to demand more. But it was a stable democracy within Latin American history, within the Latin American context. So if you go back to the late 1920s, early 1930s, there was actually a military regime in power in Chile. And if you go back even further to the late 1800s, there was actually a civil war in Chile where the president ended up committing suicide. And that civil war was precisely over the control of the country's resources. And that part of Chilean history was a part that President Allende referred to many times, that he did not want to see a division of the armed forces, and he did not want to see a replay of that aspect of Chilean history. Now, if you move forward to the 1940s and 50s, what you see there is that, yes, the United States is now able to influence and expand its power to the southern cone. They had been doing that. Washington had been doing that in the late 1800s in the Caribbean and in Central America. But now they're able to, what they say matters in Santiago, in Buenos Aires, in Montevideo. So that's why they played a far more active role, and that's why the Chilean elites and the hard right were able to travel to Washington, put in their complaints, and obtain their support. And as Clinton says, that support was vital for them to carry out a successful coup d'état. And if you look through the diplomatic cables during many 20th century coups in Latin America, that's my area of interest. One thing that constantly comes up is the question: how long will it take for Washington to recognize us? That's the key concern by the generals in Latin America that are carrying out coup d'états. And when are they going to recognize us? And if Washington's not going to recognize us first, well, then who's going to recognize us? And if it's the Brazilians that are doing it, is that because they've had conversations with the U.S. ambassador, and after that, do you promise that after that you will then recognize us? And they're very, very sensitive to that, because if you go back to the early 20th century, when, for example, in Argentina there were coups, these were more sort of personal rivalries and different factions. But once you move into the 1940s and 50s onwards, the coups that are taking place, they're not power plays between different generals and elite economic interests. These are coups that have been discussed and planned with the support of the United States. And what Washington has to say now, it really matters. And that was definitely the case in Chile.
Rodrigo and Clinton, thank you both for joining us today and for sharing your insights on The Focus.
John, thank you as always. It's nobody gets out of your show without a detailed explanation and a discussion. It is not the intellectual work that has to be done to keep up with you is unique. Thank you.
Thank you. And to our audience, thanks for tuning into the Focus podcast. We hope that you found today's discussion enlightening and thought-provoking. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to reach out to us on social media. You can find the Focus on Facebook, referenced on the John Bruni and Sage International LinkedIn pages, and on Twitter, or on the Sage International website, sageinternational.com.au, by clicking the media drop-down menu and hitting podcasts. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and or leave us a review on your favorite platform. My thanks to our stalwart production team of Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart, and to the team of the Ozcast Network. Join us again next time as we continue to delve into the most pressing current affairs issues of our time. Until then, stay informed and stay engaged. I'm John Bruni, and from Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.